Hi, welcome to Survivor Chat. I'm Heather Banks, a cervical cancer survivor, survivor ambassador, and survivor's lead advocacy educator. At Survivor, we feel really strongly that knowledge is power and that empowering our community with information and knowledge is key to what we do. And that is what Survivor Chats are all about. We're here to connect you with experts and professionals in the field to add to your advocacy if you're out there advocating, to give you some important information and knowledge, and to hopefully give you some new perspective possibly on certain topics. Our topic today is clinical trials, and our guest is Dr. Oliver Rosen, the Chief Medical Officer at SQZ Biotechnologies. Hello, Oliver. How are you today?
Good morning, Heather. Very well, thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us. Let's start by you just giving us some information about yourself, who you are, what you do, and how you and your company are connected directly or even indirectly to cervical cancer.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm a medical oncologist, and as I said, I work for SQZ Biotechnologies. We live in the Boston area in Massachusetts. How am I connected? I would say throughout my career as a medical oncologist, I was always really, interested in this partnership between patients and patient advocacy and physicians. And so, because obviously everybody has their own perspective, and it is really important to understand exactly what the needs are, what the concerns are within the patient community. And as you said, Heather, knowledge is power. So we will be better powered if we know what patients need. So I hope that addresses your question.
It does. Thank you. And we're going to talk a little bit later about you and your company's perspective on patients, which is really inspiring. So we'll get back to that in just a little bit. But let's start with it's a simple question, but it's also a pretty complicated one. And it is, what is a clinical trial? I think a lot of our community has heard about the term clinical trial. Some of the patients and survivors and thrivers in our community have been through clinical trials. So there's a pretty wide degree of knowledge of what is a clinical trial. So can you define it pretty simply and basically for our community?
I would say the simplest question are the best ones, because that really helps us in assessing opportunities. And so a clinical trial, I would say, is an opportunity for patients where it either tests the benefit of an experimental drug for patients in a given disease, or on the other hand, another type of clinical trials, they assess a different way of treating a given cancer, like cervical cancer. Yeah? So this can be a more aggressive way of treating cancer because past treatments were not effective enough, or it can be a less aggressive way because patients are suffering from adverse events, from side effects afterwards. And in the first case, testing of new experimental drugs, that's obviously something that advances the field the most. Because we need to, in many ways, need to have more effective treatments. There is a kind of a series of trials until somebody would say, this is a trial now that should be accessible for patients by prescription. And the last thing I will say is that there is in some ways, there is a benefit for a patient directly when they undergo a clinical trial, because they will have access to new treatment options. Or on the other hand, access to safer or more aggressive treatment options. But it's not always the case. There's also trials where patients get randomized. And so in this sense, then it is kind of the benefit for the next generation if the patient would get to standard of care, but they never lose in a clinical trial. That's very important for people to know. You cannot lose by going on a clinical trial. If a new option does not work, then you obviously at least had access to a new option, and then future generations will know that it's not working. But we have to assume every patient a cancer patient gets offered to date is based on clinical trials. Yeah?
I like that. I like when you said, the patient can never lose in the trial. I've never heard that before, and I think that's a really great maybe perspective to have.
Yeah, I would also, if I may add to this, because that is, in my view, also a very important aspect. Things have changed. I mean, this has not always been the situation, but I think it is, particularly for a small company, very important to really provide the best science for patients that we would offer to our loved ones, our friends, and that's how we conduct our clinical trial.
You know, that reminds me of something when I was going through my cancer treatments, especially initially when I had first met with my oncologist and we were figuring out, you know, what do we do treatment-wise. Something that really stuck with me and that I've even used to this day in different situations, not only with myself, but with my own children is, you know, he said, I go by the sister, daughter, mother rule. And he said, you know, I look at my patients as if you were my mother or my sister or my daughter, how would I advise you, or what would I, you know, tell you to do and recommend? And that made me feel really comfortable just as his patient. But it also was a really great perspective, I feel. And I've actually turned that around in different situations to different doctors that I've met with over the past. And so something you just said just definitely reminded me of that. And that's great to hear. So let's talk a little bit about your company specifically and what trials and work do you currently have for cervical cancer patients?
We have one trial right now that is kind of catered to patients with hepatopapilloma, human papillomavirus 16, and cervical cancer. In most cases, are driven by HPV, and the largest portion is HPV 16. And so we offer this trial for patients. It's a phase 1 study. So this means we're in a very early phase. But that's why it's very important what I said before. This is traditionally offered for patients who don't have a lot of other options, or where the existing options are not really very promising. And then patients decide to go on such a phase 1 trial because they know the other options that are not as good, they don't go away. They can still have access to these options afterwards. And so it is kind of called a cell therapy, what we do. We generate a vaccine. It's so to say, a personalized vaccine. Patients donate their blood cells when they enter the trial, and then within approximately a week, they can start treatment. And the drug supply that would not be used cannot use for any other patient. It's really just very specifically catered to the patient who participates in our trial.
And how do patients get connected with clinical trials to begin with, whether it's yours or any other ones? How does that typically take place?
So often a patient has a treating physician and treating oncologist, and they might offer certain treatment options, and they might also offer, they might often offer a trial also as an option. And so what patients often do is they ask for a second opinion, and then often they go to a kind of a larger cancer center and to understand whether they would have options for a clinical trial that they didn't get at the primary cancer center. But I would also say, and that is something that inspires me in our partnership with working, for example, like Cervivor, it is helpful for patients also to find their own kind of ways to gather information. And so, and I think that's where an organization like Cervivor is a very powerful mediator in this sense, by helping people to understand how can I look for a clinical trial that might make sense for me.
I love that. Yes, we could definitely help with that. And there are many ways, I think, or just different ways that you can go about finding clinical trials, and that whether it's through your physician or an organization like us, Cervivor, can help too, or at least point you in a certain direction. Okay, so about a week ago, I put onto our social media, some of our social media platforms, I said I'm going to be doing a Survivor Chat with, you know, a doctor from a company who works for clinical trials. Do you have any ideas for questions that you would like me to ask? And I found one that I thought was really great. And you addressed it a little bit earlier, but I definitely think it's worth spotlighting for sure. And their question with, this is from our group, I'm a Survivor in Facebook. She asked, this is a patient, survivor, or thriver, as we like to say, what are the advantages or benefits of being in a clinical trial?
Yeah, so as you said, it's probably a really important topic. So forgive me if I'm repeating what I said before, but I think it's really essential as an essential question. So because I strongly believe also when I was working in academia that there are a lot of situations where kind of standard of care, so what one would be able to prescribe you is the most appropriate treatment option. But I think when you do an academic career, and obviously also when you work for a small biotech company and you see how much you can kind of drive the development of a drug, it is probably really important to always consider whether there's a clinical trial option. And the benefits for a clinical trial option is really, in one way, access to an investigational drug that we would not get access to. That's one option. And the other option is really this new way of treating a disease. So if patients, if the tumor is well controlled with a given treatment option, but people would realize that there's a lot of side effects from the treatment, then they try to de-escalate the treatment, so to make it less aggressive. On the other hand, if a lot of patients have failed in what is normally used as a treatment option, then they make it more aggressive. So it's really access to new drugs or an improved treatment approach to a given disease. These are the most important benefits. My father was unfortunately diagnosed with Alzheimer's for several years ago, and he participated in a clinical trial. And he did not get to the experimental arm, but at least there was no other chance to get him on an experimental drug without joining a clinical trial. That's why I said nobody can lose in a clinical trial because there would have been no treatment that would have been very specific that he could have received at the time.
I also think, and you know, what you're touching into is there's benefits. There could be benefits personally for the patient, but you're also, quote unquote, helping science, you know, helping the field and helping to advance patients who come after you, you know, in terms of looking back years ahead, you might be helping to advance the field, to advance the standard of care, even that future patients will receive. And that's a really important thing, I think, for people who are considering a clinical trial to remember and to keep in mind, because I think a lot of times we maybe don't think about that part of it necessarily.
Yeah, we probably also don't think about the fact that if I undergo cancer treatment, it is based on results from clinical trials.
Oh, yeah, I like that.
That's very important also to keep that in mind. Yeah, I think we're in some ways always interested in raising awareness about clinical trials, that to have better awareness, because it's only 5% of cancer patients who go on clinical trials, and I'm personally quite aware of even in phase 1 studies where patients had dramatic benefits, and they would have not had these benefits. There's enough stories out there that somebody was told that they don't have a long life expectancy anymore, and they wanted to be in charge of their life and said, I'll try a clinical trial, and it paid off for them. You know? It's not guaranteed that everybody goes on a clinical trial. That's also important, but it is a very important part of advancing medicine for all.
Yeah, and encouraging. It's encouraging to hear on a lot of different levels. Okay, so at Survivor, our community, we take real pride in knowing that the work that we do kind of represents the real people behind cervical cancer, right? Through our stories and all the advocacy that we do. we take a lot of pride in just knowing that we are representing this disease and we are the real people behind it. Your company SQZ Biotechnologies puts a lot of emphasis, from what I've gathered, on patients and a lot of value on patients, which is really encouraging. So I'd love for you to talk about that perspective. What's the value behind what you put on patients and behind everything that you guys do?
So, I mean, you said you're the real people behind the disease, and obviously we need to also know as a company what the real issues of a disease are. And so if we would miss this, we would invest a lot of time and effort for, let's say, a new medication that would not address real issues. So that's why having this dialogue on a regular basis, and obviously getting the perspective from patients is extremely important. We as a company, we talk to scientists, we talk to physicians, but there's also this really important aspect of getting the patient perspective. I mean, there are tools nowadays in clinical trials about patient reported outcome, for example. Yeah, so to give the patient a voice, how they perceive the treatment, the toxicity, or whether it's well tolerated. And if we would just be in an ivory tower and not focus on this perspective, we might develop drugs that might not be tolerable, yeah? Or that might have some side effect that probably physicians might underestimate, and patients might say, this is not worth for me to be on this treatment. And this only can come to the surface by having a continued dialogue. Yeah?
It's interesting you say that. I was talking with someone the other day, and it was outside of the world of cervical cancer, but she was talking about a family member who was going through a clinical trial, and just, she said, she made some comment about how they don't seem to take into account, you know, what we really think and feel, or they're just, you know, they just seem to be doing it for their advantage as a company, right? And I could tell that they were really, she didn't feel, you know, that they were valuing the patient perspective. And so I think sometimes clinical trials do get that, you know, rap a little bit, right? So it's really encouraging to hear you guys and the value that you put on patients, and listening to them, and, you know, moving forward based on you know, what the patients are saying and feeling and doing. That's really encouraging.
I mean, as you said, you reached out to people with other diseases or other disease background. I had shared with you that we also try to help, so to say, to bring the patient advocacy community together, because patients with an HPV-16 positive tumor, that might affect different organs. And so some of the challenges might be very similar. And so that's why we also feel that there's more power, because we're in this together. If people understand why we do certain things, and yeah, getting together early on and sharing perspectives is, in my view, the only way to overcome kind of silos, yeah, which
absolutely, yes. You bring up that good point too of patient advocacy, which is another really big part of what we do at Cervivor. You know, it's interesting being Survivor's lead advocacy educator. I get to meet all these really incredible women and hear all these really incredible stories. And it's always fun for me to see what kind of what quote unquote platforms certain women take within cervical cancer. You know, some women really focus on, you know, the mother aspect, right, of being a cervical cancer patient and survivor. Some focus on more of the policy and the legislative piece. And the clinical trial realm of our survivorship and our thriving could be also clinical trials. You know, like there could be, you know, survivors out there who, you know, who maybe have experienced a clinical trial or are experiencing going through a clinical trial, and could really leverage that experience into a patient advocacy role and really become an advocate for patients who are going through clinical trials. And that's an important piece of you know, what can be done, for sure. Yeah. Okay, well, Oliver, thank you so much for being with us today. There is so much behind clinical trials. I know we have just skimmed the surface, but I think I think this was a great kind of introduction for our community to hear just kind of some basics and simple pieces about clinical trials, but also specifically about SQZ Biotechnologies and your company and what you do and maybe kind of what sets you apart from, in your world in what you do. So it's really been a pleasure talking with you today, and hopefully we can maybe do another one of these soon that kind of delves into maybe a different, aspect of clinical trials. But how can people connect with you, your company, stay connected with you? What's the best ways for them to do that?
I would say the best way is we and we have also some social media activity, and they can kind of sign up, so to say, for these activities. They could also just, if they send you a note and you can just forward this to me, for example, and then we make sure that what I will say is also we're in the process of kind of updating our website, and so there will be a separate patient tab, and so we'll have a specific kind of email address, but it's not yet up and running. So that's why I would say in the interim, would be appropriate just to forward the information, and we'll follow up. We promise we'll follow up. Probably not always within 24 hours, but we'll follow up.
Well, that's exciting. That's exciting though, the patient tab on your website. I know I was visiting your website a few days ago, and I found it to be very helpful, easy to navigate. So just going to your website too, I think is a great way. For those of you in our survivor community, please stay connected with us. Or if you're new to our survivor community, there are many ways to stay connected with us. We have our own YouTube channel with lots of great content on it. On Facebook, we have our main survivor page, but we also have a private group for cervical cancer patients, survivors, thrivers, and it is called I'm a Survivor. On Instagram and Twitter, you can find us on I Am Survivor. Our website is great too. There's lots of information out there, what I like to say, safe information. And one of my favorite part of our website is all the stories that you can get. You can meet lots of women and patients and survivors who are going through cervical cancer, have gone through cervical cancer, and it's always encouraging to read their stories. So stay connected with us in all of those different ways. Okay, Oliver, thank you so much again for being with us, and we look forward to our next Survivor Chat. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you. Bye.